try this. How about 5 continuing juncture points in a cross-town grid, still drawing it from the comments I was making about the mass reading of chi roots. And if we get through here, I'll pick up some more of the questions that you people are asking to have me expand upon. But here we go. I want to pick up first on what I was saying last time to connect it even further about agendas. You remember what I was saying? That what you should be doing to try and make some sense, to make some practical use out of such as this, whatever the hell it is you should be forcing people to do your agenda. And I used an example that should have been clear enough about the complaint department. I could do it with all sorts of things. I could do it you and strangers. I could do it between you and family members. I could do it between you and sexual partners. And then, as I was trying to show you, is to turn it internally in that dialogue that everyone seems to be engaged in with yourself. Now, on the surface, it could sound as though it were a real, perhaps, very agreeable and useful psychological trick, which it could be. It could be in the same kind of class as reversing the current, that is, treating people the way they treat you, putting out to people what they put out. And enough of you have done that to find out that I did not exaggerate, that it just brings everything to a standstill in that particular dance. Right? This sort of thing. You have changed the whole complexion of a dance if we were simply talking about psychological gambits. But you have changed the whole complexion of the dance. Let me jump back to my example since it seemed to be simple and clear enough. That someone is already wired up, they're already programmed. And I was talking about just an employee at a Kmart. There was no offense on employees at Kmart or people making minimum wage. But the thing is, they are not there to use some kind of creative intelligence. They're not there to improvise. Nay, even if they have the ability. That sort of job, they are given directions. Do this. Ask this question, ask the person. And I gave you a kind of potential spiel. I've never seen their manual. But it would be specifically, the first thing that they would ask is, do you have a receipt? And if you don't, then they say, well, did you buy it at this particular store? And if I was running Kmart, now I'm thinking about it, and I can imagine how life works through those kind of, that if you do not answer the first question positively, that you do not have a receipt, then there's probably a subclass under that they tell you, that is the employee at least, to look and see, is the receipt less than 6 months old? And then it probably drifts off into other subdivisions, like if it is over 6 months old, then you start going down some other line of questioning. But the point then begins to be very likely that they're trying to put you on the defensive, that they do not really want to give you a refund. It's just not good business to have people buy things and then wait 6 months. It begins to interfere. Surely you can think of this yourself, but it would begin to interfere with restocking. It would begin to interfere with them trying to keep track of how merchandise is moving. Even if their basic policy, their unconditional policy is that they will cheerfully, unconditionally give you a refund on anything you bought there. They would like for you to do it within X amount of time, or else it begins to mess up their bookkeeping, their restocking. This is done in such a way that is given to the employee that they ask the questions. That is, Kmart, or whatever the company is, sets the agenda. But this goes far beyond, as useful as it may sound to some of you, and it's correct and as useful as it may sound, it goes far beyond what would appear to be simply a surface psychological interplay wherein you might be able to exercise some new sense of power. It is much more than that. It is getting down to the sinews and the actual muscles of the way life works in certain ways. Now, to connect this and to expand it to at least 4 or 5 other things before the tape runs out, I could say to you, those of you that have been here long enough and deep enough, that I could say that an ultimate description of whatever the hell this is, having no name and no motto, and I hardly ever even call it anything, even the revolution, just whatever it is, I could almost say that an ultimate description of this would be as follows. The refusal to do anyone else's agenda. Several variations, if this will help. A refusal to seriously do anyone else's agenda. Second variation. Or if it seems you must, which is not uncommon at all, that it seems as though you must do their agenda, do not take it seriously. Now, it would not be fitting nor useful to leave it at that point to where it would sound like perhaps just a variation itself on me referring to this kind of thing paradigmatically as a revolution, because it is not just blind naysaying or rebellion against the natural flow and the normal majority flow of life, but it is not incorrect to begin to see what you are trying to do not only here, not only what you're trying to do inside of your own nervous system, but insofar as dealing in a more efficient, a less bruising manner with life itself, assuming you find your everyday affairs to be trying and bruising. If not, no problem. But one of the ways to look at that would be that you are now refusing, whenever possible, to do someone else's agenda. And all the grand and glorious descriptions, if that still does not seem lucid enough, all the marvelous past descriptions and ideas and dreams that you may have had of some sort of great revolutionary extraordinary activity, think about it. Think about your dreams of it. Think about other people's dreams and descriptions, or think about their historical descriptions of what seems to be actual living figures in the past that did this. Now think about it a second. In one sense, without me even naming names, just the great historical, apparent spiritual and intellectual giants, trailblazers, can you see that in a sense they refused to do somebody else's agenda? And it does not require that this be simply or strictly an overt act. That is, it is not necessarily limited to physically, materially refusing to go along with someone else's agenda, to follow the plan physically, visibly. As always, it would appear to be more of an internal, an intellectual, the nervous system itself in rebellion. Let me pull out 4 or 5 more and then see if I can stitch your attention together with them. Now, it's still connected. For the next one, let me present it first as a great question. Would you think that perhaps the supreme use of this, whatever it is, would be to get deeper inside for a better mapping out of man, or to get a wider perspective apparently out there for a different view of life? Which? I will bet if I had asked this several weeks or months ago, or if I put it in a different verbal context tonight, there would have been a different reaction internally from many of you. To say, is the purpose of this to get deeper inside or further outside? Now, any would-be spiritualist, metaphysician, strange person, weirdo, crackpot, follower, dreamer, throughout history would immediately have a response to that. It's obviously the former. All such activity as this, even though I don't want to call it anything or admit, ordinary intelligence would say all of this, assuming this is in some way in that same, or of that same genre, it has to be activity that is going to drive you deeper internally. Are you so fucking sure of that? Now, on the surface, humanity has been sure of that for 5,000 or 6,000 years. Are we having serious problems? It is not even, if you hear what I'm pointing towards verbally, at least for the present, it is not even open to any sort of historical, it is not open to any city level investigation or question. That this sort of thing, the people who are attracted to it to begin with, are all what? Introspective. That is, if we're going to go by such classical, psychological, and even common sense divisions of humanity, again, into two sorts of like extroverts and introverts, then who generally gets attracted to anything resembling this? Anything that even smells strange, anything that has an aroma at all of being mystical, weird, secret activity. Well, normally you find people stroking on their beard. You find people who are depressed, people who are neurotic, people who are extremely shy. But life has arranged the human nervous system, as witnessed by your own knowledge of history and the knowledge of yourself, that within itself, in an unanalyzed manner, is taken as being proof that one does at least have the potential to be some sort of intellectual or spiritual explorer. Because you do not expect, history has never expected, that suddenly some guy weighing about 320 that looks like he was a high school, if not college football player, 10 years ago, out of shape, cigar in his mouth, laughing, slapping everybody. You do not expect that sort of person to show up as a follower of whoever the latest guru is. You do not expect him, he does not show up in a camp to teach meditation. You expect to find that sort of person. And that sort of person, when you ask, do you believe this kind of activity, what it was, whatever it is? And I was talking to, letting now that sort of individual I'm describing represent the classical class of that sort of person. And you ask them, all right, do you believe that this kind of activity, whatever you think it is, it's some kind of secret, it's the inner core of Reformed Buddhism. Do you believe, let me ask you this first, before we let you in here, do you believe that this is to drive deeper internally, to go deeper inside? And there, of course, to understand, I was talking about inside of you, to drive deeper inside, or do you think this kind of activity, once it reaches fruition and you understand it, you come to some moment of enlightenment, or it all pays off, is it going to drive you deeper inside, a better knowledge, a better mapping, a better insight into you, or could it possibly be to drive you further outside for some kind of better view out there? There is no question whatsoever. If human consciousness at the ordinary level would even care to respond if I tried to, again, carry on this imaginary dialogue for you, they would say, well, not only should it be clear that the former would have to be the true purpose of this, but the latter, in fact, is ludicrous. That is, in fact, in a way in what I'm sure that we're struggling against, because who needs a better view of out there? I see enough out there. Out there sucks. That's why I want to be a better meditator. That's why I want to be a mystic. Is out there, who needs a better view? You know, it smells. It's terrible. It's unjust, it's inhumane, and blah, blah, blah. Now, I ask you, though, are you so sure? How much deeper? Now, first I'm going to have to answer for you, though. I was going to say, how much deeper do you think you're going to go in you? Now, if this was the ordinary you, of course, answering, you'd go much deeper. Because the ordinary you, old intelligence says, there's much more to me. We've only begun to scratch the surface. I've only listened to you talk now for X number of months or years, and every time we meet, I go deeper and deeper and deeper into myself, and I see more and more and more. And I've told you, no, you don't, no, you don't, no, you don't. Since I asked another question some weeks back, I've had several of you here and out of town already dropped me a note. You didn't have much to say other than the fact that I understood what you were expressing, and that is that you were taken by me asking, could you conceive of it being possible, and then to what possible end, if I were to quit apparently talking about what seems to be the inner structure, condition of man. That is the continual evolution of the nervous system, and then the specific, short-term forcing of an extension of the nervous system by an individual. That if I cease doing that apparently, at least verbally, and then start taking the very things that I use of economics and military and history, psychology, and use the external world as a springboard to turn your attention inwards, if we started on my external examples, and I continued and never went inside, that only talked about life out there, what would you make of that? Could I do it? Could you hear it? Would there be any difference? What would be the significance if you thought, well, there is no difference? And what should that tell you? As I said, a few of you have understood what you were trying to express. You expressed like, wow, you didn't know what else to do, or you didn't try to tell me anything else. Does anybody see that I have not forgotten that? I'm simply trying to give you a slightly different view of it. But anybody, they do not have to be involved with some strange activity, meeting in secret somewhere, dressed up weird. People who believe that they're trying to improve themselves. I don't mean just lose a little weight, just give up smoking. But someone attempting to improve themselves by getting more education, by trying to refine some nascent talent they may have, to try to be more artistic, to try and be a better person, to try and be more compassionate, to do something that they would feel is spiritual or emotional. All attempts to improve oneself out in the city at the ordinary level would respond to my question by saying the point of any self-improvement is to go deeper in you. Now, for the third time, I'm going to ask you, you, not them, are you sure of that? Does it strike any of you interesting that if you can hear the validity of what I'm pointing out from the ordinary view, that there is no small structure, there is no limited activity in life that would be a corollary to this, wherein the kind of activity seems to be absolutely directed toward getting the people involved to look deeper into out there. There is none. Contraire, the people who seem to be more involved out there are looked at as being poster children for Philistines from the other view. That is, those who attempt to be spiritual look upon those who apparently have most of their attention out here, which great examples would be politicians, businessmen, people who apparently have almost no inner life, no soul. They're the very ones that those who think that they're doing something extraordinary would find to be anathema. But are they sure? Well, yeah, they're sure. If I'm asking you, all right, for the fourth time, are you sure? How about all the things I have used not just in general of psychology and sociology and etc., but how about some of the specifics, the times that I spent for a while hitting the old idea, the old conspiracy theories ideas that have always been extant, that there is a secret conspiracy of some group of people. If you're in France, you believe it's a bunch of Germans. If you're in Germany, you believe it's a bunch of Danes. You know, if you're in Norway, you believe it's a bunch of Italians. That there is a conspiracy, and I use that as a springboard in several directions, those of you that were here and remember it, to point out that it is based upon validity. That is an unrecognized admission that life has allowed people to sense, not be able to think about. That is, that what we think is running things ain't running things. And then it comes out, as always, into a very simplistic, ill-defined, unprofitable, unusable feeling that, all right, it's a bunch of men, it's a bunch of Germans somewhere meeting in secret, and they're pulling all the strings financially and politically throughout the world, and they're the ones running everything. They make depressions, they make recessions, and they up the price of gold, then they sell all their gold and it drives it down, and they come back and they buy up all the gold at cut rate prices. Yeah, you don't fool me, there is a conspiracy, always has been. And those that are not that inclined, of course, believe there is a conspiracy of evil forces. Devils, Satan, Lucifer and all of his henchmen. What if, instead of me using that, I was trying to take you from wide areas of just psychology and economics, what if I had taken that and never said anything else except that is internally, and just expanded that? Now, since there is no background for this, and since I did not do it, and you would be hard-pressed to imagine how, the first thing that would strike ordinary intelligence is, well, if you did that, it'd go in the absolutely opposite direction, because all you could do is then begin to reinforce that, hey, there is a literal, physical, out there conspiracy. That if you're not going to turn that internally and make it a metaphor, then it's got to be reality, right? Is that the best you can do? That everything's got to either be a metaphor or reality? Come on. Of course, I'll admit that's unfair, because to ask ordinary intelligence that, ordinary intelligence answer is, yeah. That I'm a stupo. That it is either reality or it's a metaphor. All right, let's forget them, and I ask you now. Two choices? That's it? It's got to be one or the other? Is anyone cognizant of the fact that I have not changed the subject from the second paragraph? For me to ask, does everything either have to be a statement of reality or a metaphor? You understand, you see the connection between that and my first question of the second paragraph. Is this activity indeed ultimately, supremely directed toward driving one into a deeper knowledge, plotting, understanding view internally, or a wider, more coherent one out there? Does anybody see? Of course, this is not true at the two-eyed level, but does anybody see that that is the same thing as saying, well, is everything either real or a metaphor? Are you either talking about are you talking about a conspiracy? Are you actually talking about going on, or are you just using that as a metaphor for some of the kinds of vague uncertainties of the human intellect? That's my choices? Really? You realize what life has done, if you stay at that level, has done to you again, is welcome. Welcome, you little rascal, standing in line for the you-know-what, to entertain you. We have Bastard and Robbins here. You can have any flavor of ice cream you want as long as it's chocolate or vanilla. That's good to know. Any flavor you want. Any. And you ask life. That is, you ask your own dialogue. Any? Any. As long as it's chocolate or vanilla. But any. Any. Wow. All right, I'll have chocolate. But now you said any. Yeah, I did. All right, can I change it? Anytime you want. All right, I'll take vanilla. I just wanted to check. Okay, you got it. No, wait a minute, I won't check. All right. Do things have to be real and actually exist in some way in the external world that they like to sometimes refer to as objective existence? Is it either that, if it's something that the intellect can define, if it's something the intellect can name and limb, then is it either reality that you're talking about, or is it a metaphor? You're right. It's unlimited, the possibilities, as long as it's one or the other. When I said I was going to be closing up the first act of all this is getting close to it. Because if that's all you can perceive, if you believe that you have now, through my great leadership and the force of my brilliant personality, now have you to the point that oftentimes you can look around at the surprising intellectual, or at the surprising economic torture that suddenly has hit Venezuela, or if you can look at the surprising turn back to the right of political events in the recent elections in El Salvador and go, ah, and there is a tropic message. There is a metaphor of what's going on in you and in humans right there on the front page. And if that's it, and if you feel like, if I would take thanks or a birthday present, if I had a birthday, that you'd go, God, how great it was that I've done this. That's really fitting. If there was a whole race of revolutionists, I'd have to tell you that would be a fitting, be like a bar mitzvah for a revolutionist. That's the sort of thing, that's the kind of intellect that a real revolutionist would have had about the age of 12. I've hinted around before. It's the kind of thing a real revolutionist, which is no offense now if you can go back now and you wouldn't be here if you could. But that's the sort of thing by the age of 12 that you should have been able to ask all the questions. Trace down enough priests, rabbis, relatives, your own family, and you ask them several questions. The leaders of the world, and you find out that they don't know anything. Then, at that age, that kind of mystical, revolutionary bar mitzvah on your own, nobody can give it to you, by the way, so don't look for a party, even if you had been alive back then. All you can do is throw your own party. And most places, at 12, you're too young to drink anyway, so you have to figure out your own way to celebrate. But there, for a split second, you might see all of this as a metaphor. That here I am, a little nipper, at the age of 12, don't know anything, and even the questions I've asked these people, not only do they not know the answer, I'm running a risk of getting kicked probably in some sensitive parts by asking these people the question, because I can see, it suddenly strikes me, the question just barely makes sense to them, whereas the question is basic, such as, does anybody know anything? But of course I really simplified it, because even at the age of 12 you could not go ask adults that. That is life. That is ordinary city intelligence. You have to ask more specifically. Does anyone see that could be the end of Act 1? Does anybody see that I am insisting that some of you have got to get past that point of being satisfied? I know how much fun it is. And look how much I've done with it all this length of time. That everything is a metaphor. Everything can be a metaphor. Everything has some internal, intellectual significance, and is in some way, if you can see it, absolutely a reflection of what's going on out there. And some of you who really get good and can do a kind of two-step without Lawrence Welk's participation can also see quite easily that what goes on out there does indeed reflect in here. So we've got a two-way metaphor. On the larger scheme of things, that should be good 2 or 3 minutes, 2 or 3 hours worth of celebration. When it gets into ordinary life, it can be 2 or 3 years worth of celebration. But the time comes, enough's enough. Why take things as a metaphor if you don't have to? Withal, why take things as reality when you don't have to? But now, why take them as having to be either one or the other if there's another possibility? So you notice now nobody laughs. Everybody laughs at first two, like, ha ha ha. It's like, you have a funny face painted on your palm. You hold it up, people go, ha ha ha, and you say, yeah, but. And you go, and you hold it the other way, and you got another face, they go, ha ha ha. And then you go, there is no third possibility. Funny face, back of the funny face. Or a funny face and a funny moon. And the guy's bent over in the back of his head. But you do this, there is no other possibility. Yeah, there is. It's right after Act 1. See if you can see a connection. Let's try another paragraph. Let me give you this as a question. Human problems, personal difficulties, whatever they are human problems common and public, or private and personal? Now turn that on yourself. Just take what your own dialogue, what your own level of intelligence, your own level apparently of experience, it tells you are your problems. Pick any one, anything that just strikes you, it doesn't matter what. Now I ask you, is that problem, is it common and public? That is, do other people share that problem? Not yours, but do other people have that problem? Is it discussed? Let's say that you have bouts of depression. I don't know how many rounds you go, but let's say you have bouts of depression. Is depression, whatever the reality of it is, but is depression a public, a common problem? And before you answer, or is it private and personal, individual? Now most of you should know that you're running a severe risk to immediately think that one or the other has got to be at the expense of the other, that one of them has to be correct. But at first, well, I'll speak for ordinary intelligence rather than have anybody make an individual ass of yourself. I'll do it commonly and publicly. I'll do it for everyone. Ordinary intelligence would first say, all right, an individual problem by its very definition, that is I have depression, then in a sense it is not, it can't be common and public. Wait a minute. Think about it a little more. You wouldn't even know what depression is unless there was at least one other person on this planet that had depression, and that person, and that person, and that person had the ability, which you would not have had evidently, they had the ability to describe it and stick a name on it. Of course, I am really exaggerating in the de minimis of this to bring it down to one other person, because if it is something that you can consider to be a problem, and it's got to have a name, or else it's an undefinable, it's an unknown problem, it's just a vague uneasiness. But if it is a problem, then it is commonly shared by some segment of the human race. So depression, you've got to see that in a sense it is a common and a public. Public, it is no secret, you wouldn't know about it. You would just say, well, I feel uneasy. If it was not publicly known and somebody said, well, I think you're depressed. You go, do what? Spell that. You've never heard of it. So ordinary intelligence could say, well, all problems then, in a sense, now that you put it that way, I guess have to be common and public. See how easily ordinary intelligence will go, but wait. Instead of letting your own dialogue, your own intelligence try and look at it from the basis of does the question actually inquire as to whether I alone experience this? Try and expand that a bit. Let's look at the basis of it. Let's look at the mere existence, the basic existence of how this comes about. Do human problems, do they arise in some way, such as, did one person discover depression? If we're going to look at humanity being in a part of life itself, a totally alive entity, and that each person was like a pore, right quick, then if life had this pus that we're going to later call depression at some time, and life in some way is mashing itself, and so depression becomes a reality. I'm not trying to be gross. All right, look at it as life is trying to get out frosting for a cake. How about that? That makes you feel better. And it has this little pastry, this little baker's bag, and it only has one little hole. That is, and so it mashes, and this pastry, or this pus comes out, and it's called depression. Did it come out in one person? Is that how depression, is that how any human problem came about? That is, that it came out in one person, and it became contagious, or it spread. Think about it, just for a second. That's very inefficient. Could you really conceive of life, if you have any overview of life now, operating in such a simplistic manner? Such a energy deficient, inefficient manner. It's like depression, or whatever the human problem is. It is as though it is just suddenly a fair-sized plague upon humanity. That is, it seems to suddenly pop up all over the place. There's not some historical reference somewhere, although if you want to quick buy stuff, those of you that are getting good at this, please note the kinds of spiritual attempts through so-called religions to detail the creation of humanity, which of course is just city consciousness, simplistic consciousness, trying to run back down its own nervous system and to find a point of origin, and it always gets down to a very simplistic, non-essential, non-useful level. But one of the things they do, they don't look at it this way, is attempt to show how problems started. For those of you that are Christians and Jews, think about the good old Genesis book, down to one person. Well, there were two of them there, Adam and Eve, but one of them's the one that caused the trouble, and we know which one that was. Wasn't us guys. But like, if you want to look at the first problem, getting God pissed off, I'd say, is just one step away from being depressed. But notice the stories get down. You notice where I took the side step. You hadn't lost your place, have you? I was going to point out that things I was going to try and get you to see that was most inefficient to think that some human problem started with one person, or even a dozen person, but one person. But the stories throughout all religions, in a sense, try to identify that there was indeed a spot that you could look, that there was one pore somewhere, a hole in God's great plan, a hole in the Garden of Eden, a hole in decency, and her name was Eve. Or if you're a woman, I guess you can blame it on Adam. Well, he made me do it, whatever it was. But the story seems to point out that the problems, now all you need is one problem. It's like they let one problem loose upon humanity, and it went from God getting mad to having to go to work. I believe what. Isn't there somewhere in that story that God says, get out of here, and your curse from now on is you got to go and work the land, go get a job and pay taxes. So you went from one thing, one little thing. We ate that one apple, and he said don't do it, that one thing, and after that it was just like a multitude. After that was go to work, get headaches, get depressed, get fearful, get shy, get overbearing. And so the story is, that's not the only purpose for him, but seems to point at exactly what I'm saying on the other side of the coin. But back to the main trail, you didn't lose your place, did you? It would be inefficient that a human problem that is now in wide circulation, which all good human problems are, or you wouldn't have heard of them. It would have been most inefficient to imagine that it came about through a private, personal outlet. That is, that one person got depressed and then started talking it up, and everybody's around went, well, hey, I want to be depressed. That sounds neat. Or everybody wanted to be fattish. Or like I said, it was like a virus and it spread. It's like whatever it is, whatever the human problem is, you look around if you think you got it, unless you're really way out of the bell curve. But if you're part of the bourgeoisie of human life, whatever problem you have, all you got to do is get past the age of 12 or so, and you look around or ask your mother, ask your father, and say, I got this problem. You tell them what it is, and assuming that they're fairly in the middle of the bell curve too, they'll go, hey, that is a pretty yucky problem. And I'm sorry to hear that since you are my kid, but let me tell you this. You're not unique. So, the basis of human problems, back to my question, are they common and public, like it's just a plague, it's just suddenly there? Or are they private and personal? Have I stirred it enough for you? Can you see that there are at least 5 different directions to go with this? But notice, turn on one. Turn to your own inner dialogue, your own level of intelligence. Every problem you have, without any analyzation, without any further attempt to think about it outside the own limits of your own ordinary thought processes, you take that problem as being personal. Rightfully so. Nothing wrong, of course. At the ordinary level, of course, you would have to take it personally, or you would think, if you had this ability to do it simultaneously, you would think, I'm going nuts. That is, I've got a personal problem, but now I look at it, it's not personal. Then if you had even a modicum left of any sort of middle-class sanity, with your final breath, sane breath, you'd rush and dial 911 if they had it for a psychiatric vehicle to come get you. The point of that was, a personal problem is indeed personal. How did it get to be personal? In you now, individually. How did it go from being widely known that, well, depression strikes many people, son or daughter. I'm sorry to hear about it, and we'll try to get you some drugs or we'll do something, but at least don't worry, it's not fatal, and you have not been singled out by the gods. A lot of people are depressed. Your aunt used to be depressed before she killed herself, before she died. A lot of people get depressed. When, though, now of course, we better turn the tape over. How much? Well, wait a minute. All right. Here's another spot, a real quick sidestep before we turn the tape over. I was going to lead your attention, those of you that are following this, some of you who didn't guess, to point out, I was going to make it like the question, when did you at some time suddenly get depressed? When did you sit down and think, let's see, what kind of problems will I have now that I'm almost grown? Let's say I'll be depressed. I don't know, I'm being silly. Or what event, what thing happened, what childhood trauma happened that right there, up to that point, depression to you was just a word. Word you heard on game shows. You heard about your poor aunt who went to live with Elvis. Well, what event that you suddenly went through that event and got through and went, I'm a changed person? Yeah, I am. Now I'm depressed. When? And the answer is you don't know when, but the little side trip I was going to give you, similar parallel to what I was talking about, the religious stories, is now offshoots of that, is the idea of psychology of saying there was a point that made you depressed. Nobody can find it. But you understand the same way with the stories that in some way if we can undo the way in which we've offended the gods, things will be all right. Nobody can do it. But in the same way now it's psychological that if we could run backwards, if I can go back down the line of time, at least in my mind, and I'll find the point wherein I was traumatized in such a way that there was some event. It's just so far in my subconscious. I can't remember if there had to be something that made me get depressed, that made me inclined to be depressed, because I certainly wasn't born being depressed. In the city, no one can believe that. And so they believe, they think. It's a variation of the Adam and Eve story in Genesis in this part of the world, that in some way if I could back up, we can undo the damage wherein my particular problem started. Now I'll turn the tape over. Going into another paragraph, but I'm going to leave you verbally. All right, I'll be a little cruder. To ask whether human problems, a problem that you have, human problems in general, that is, either you can think about it as being your inclination to be depressed, or you can think about it as the general word of depression striking many many people throughout history. Either way you want it, doesn't matter. My question, that is me trying to get you to look in different directions intellectually. My question as to whether human problems of all stripes, all difficulties, whether they are common in public, in origin, in execution, in effect, or are they private and personal? That would seem to cover it all, and that doesn't cover it all. It covers that. But I bring it up in this way for a reason, for a specific reason tonight, and tied to some things of the night before last, and here we go a bit further. Don't lose your place. Still further connections. Back to my opening move, that I said that an ultimate description of this, whatever it is, could always have been, and could very properly be now, the refusal to do someone else's agenda. Or, if it seems you must do it, is don't take it seriously. Because there's no doubt, I didn't stop, but all of you understand at the city level, the ordinary level of life, you're always, to some degree, going to do somebody else's agenda unless you're going to become a hermit, which is a form of suicide for people like you. So you're going to do, to some degree, you're going to work, probably most of you, you're going to pay taxes, you're going to obey the traffic laws when there's a chance of getting caught, and all that stuff. But in relationship to the attempt, the refusal, but the attempt not to do someone else's agenda, but then if you must, which to varying degrees you must, is do not take it seriously. In connection to that, I could give you a slogan to go along with that for the night. And that slogan would be, and some of you should like this, because this not only, first off, to some of you people's recollection of things you believe I've mapped out and mentioned, but plus some of you people's own conception of what is proper and worthwhile, is going to at first strike a bunch of you that I've got it backwards. But then some of you it may be that I didn't actually get it backwards, but I went into the crack somewhere that doesn't make sense. Now the sense is going to make sense. Are you ready? The slogan to go along with refusing to do somebody else's agenda could be, a temporary and ad hoc slogan would be that you have got to get free of the moment. And the moment is this moment. How about, all of you got to be as well read as I am about matters mystical. How about how many would be spiritual, intellectual, all kinds of systems and theories and philosophies, even almost cocktail hour psychology, built around the idea that you have got to live right this second. I'm telling you, you got to get free of the moment. If you can't get free of the moment, then under all ordinary conditions now, you're going to always be doing somebody else's agenda. Do you want me to tell you why? Yes, would you? All right, be my pleasure. Got 30 seconds left. All right, the tape's running out. Well, I'll have to say you some other time. You know why that you're almost certain to be doing somebody else's agenda forever? Is because you're going to be continually surprised. Being surprised in the ordinary sense, being surprised in the ordinary fashion, is almost always a sure lead-in to doing somebody else's agenda. You walk up with your 2-year-old widget to the complaint department at Kmart, needing the money, whatever the reason, wanting a refund, no receipt, no good economic, decent Christian basis for trying to pull this kind of dastardly D on those nice folks at Kmart. And you sit it down. You've seen their signs that says, unconditional, friendly, cheerful refunds on any item we sell. Have a nice day. It's across the front of the store, and so you walk in and you set it down, and the person says, where's your receipt? All you got to do is be surprised, and you're doing somebody else's agenda. It's just almost a certainty. Almost a certainty. The light goes on. You hear the siren. You pull over. You're not sure what, and suddenly the friendly face of a cop is looking in the window, and it says, how old are you? All right, so I was a little funny. Because you figured you knew what I was going to have the cop say. Whatever it is, listen to me. I did that to make a point here right quick if you can follow me. Whatever it says, and I'm just going to do what they say in movies, I'm going to do what you've heard cops say, and yet there you sit under the conditions that happens, and the cop says, do you know how fast you were going? And you're surprised. It's like the Kmart person saying, do you have a receipt? You're surprised. But now listen. What kind of walking around in the city idiot can find somebody behind a complaint counter to say, where's your receipt? And you're suddenly thrown. How can you be surprised by that? The cop says, can I see your license? You are surprised. Do you hear me? The reality of it. And do not sit there and be as dumb as to listen to your own old inner dialogue and say, well, that is about what a cop would say, and that wouldn't be that surprising. What's a cop going to say? Are you going to say, can I see your license? Are you going to say, do you know how fast you were going? Or are you going to say, are you drinking? I mean, there's only a few things a cop can get the thing started with. All right? But do you hear me when you sit there, when you're in the situation? Ordinary intelligence is continually, in the ordinary sense, surprised. I'm going to have to wait here a second. Some of you got to hear that. Not a big, I'm having to exaggerate like the cop when he says, do you have a license? And you go, no, I went through all that. The cop may say, do you have a license? Or may I see your license? And you may immediately, your hand may be trembling a little, but you won't go through all this. You might immediately go, well, certainly. But when you sit there, and he walks up, you know he's walking up, and me doing it after the fact now, if you listen to old intelligence, your old intelligence could say to you right now, and you could listen to it seriously if you're that dumb, if you're that ordinary, and say, well, I could draw out the scenario right now. A cop stops me, I pull over, I see him walking up before he gets here. I can guess, I can almost bet money that he's going to say, sir, could I see your license? So I would not be surprised. You are wrong. It doesn't have to be jaw-dropping surprise. You're surprised on this basis, that you feel like you are always dancing to somebody else's tune. You are always doing somebody else's dialogue. You're always doing their agenda. You are the passive part of their questionnaire. That there you sit in your car, there you stand in front of Kmart. The Kmart, you evidently, from one view, you took the active part. The complaint department didn't come to your house. You got out of your house, got in your car and drove there and walked up to them. And as soon as you walked up to them, you said, I'd like to return this. Like, well, I'm in charge. It's like you asked Kmart to let's dance. And then what happens? You get surprised. You start having to do their agenda, and it normally happens on this basis. Or the easiest one for me to start describing is you get questioned. You have a receipt? Do you know how fast you were going? Do you know that you're on an interstate, sir? Do you know what the speed limit still is in Tennessee on the interstate? How can you say you're surprised? You knew you were in Tennessee. You knew you were on the state highway. You just passed a sign that's big. saying in Tennessee, the speed limit on the interstate is still 55, you mother. And yet when it happens, you're surprised. There is a kind of planning, there is a kind of preparation to keep from doing somebody's agenda that is almost an inescapable necessity, and I have hesitated a long time to try to describe it because it sounds so crude. I have given it out in bits and pieces through methods and tricks, even through excursions. You've got to plan beforehand not to take anybody else's agenda seriously. You can't plan absolutely to be free of everybody else's agendas when I gave you the variations of it to begin with, to say that to do this, or one ultimate description of this, is the refusal to do anybody else's agenda. That was the way I opened up tonight, if you recall, which is ultimately three-dimensionally impossible. It's impossible. Simply on the basis, to use an obvious one, you got to pay taxes. Let's just say that. There are things that you have to do in life. Then I gave you the variation. All right, is don't seriously do anybody else's agenda. And I gave you a variation of that. All right, if apparently you're going to have to do it, don't take the doing it seriously. As long as you are not prepared for life's agenda, you're going to constantly be surprised, whether you like my use of the word or not. You're going to constantly be surprised by that, which ex post facto, you can say, well, I could have predicted that. And of course, if I was dumb enough to talk to ordinary intelligence, I'd say, well, how the hell didn't you? You say, well, I just did, now. So, there's no talking to that kind of intelligence, except for other levels of that intelligence, and then they can have a jolly good time of it. Because notice, if you hadn't noticed, your life up until now internally. I guess perhaps somewhere along the line, if I'm not going to do it, some of you should come up with some new word. I'll let you start making up new words. A kind of ballroom masturbation, I guess it would be, dancing with yourself. Or working on your own spare time. It passes for the internal thought process. There's a way in which you have got to prepare to not be surprised. Because as long as you are subject to the ordinary surprises in the ordinary sense, in the ordinary fashion, it is almost always a certain lead-in. You're one step away from doing somebody else's agenda. As soon as they ask you a question and you have any feeling, don't wrestle with my word surprise, but somebody asks you a question, the cop says, do you know what the speed limit is in Tennessee? And internally, your kind of dialogue is such things as, Tennessee? When did I leave Kentucky? Am I in Tennessee? Is the speed limit here different? You're surprised. Don't tell me after the fact, well, I knew it would say that. Or don't say, well, I knew that a complaint department, just out of force of habit, they just always, they say, well, can I see your receipt? Whether they care about it or not, they're going to ask that. And yet there you stood saying, I'd like to return this, get my money back. And the person says, where's your receipt? You go, receipt. Look in the back. You are surprised. You've got to be prepared to not be surprised. You have got to be prepared not to take anybody else's agenda seriously, because once you're surprised, their agenda is now dancing forward. You are now following. You have got to be prepared, in a sense, not to be trapped in this moment of time, because as soon as you are surprised, you are trapped in this moment. By all three-dimensional views of intelligence, you are trapped right then at that second. You're having to apparently deal with life, the cop, the complaint department person. You are suddenly nose to nose with them, and they have taken the first aggressive step. That is, they're dancing forward. You are now submissive for a second, and that's the only second that counts, because now their agenda is working. Those of you seeing these tapes, I've been around in other cities for a few times, regardless of what I've already said tonight, I've got to stop for a second and point out to you that this has got nothing to do ultimately with returning junk to Kmart or handling cops. That's not even what I'm talking about. It just seems to be what I'm talking about. These are not psychological ploys. These are not simply tricks to manipulate other people and to get them to take back your 2-year-old widget and give you a full refund. When I keep saying doing somebody else's agenda, we're not talking about Kmart. I'm not talking about the police. I'm not even talking about the police department. I'm not talking about society. I'm talking about, some of you already know who. Life. It's life's agenda. It's life's agenda for the middle class, for the city, for prevailing intelligence. And people are continually surprised at life. People are continually surprised that what they said later they knew would happen, happened. The preparations I'm referring to are unnatural, they're revolutionary. They got no motto, they got no real good name. I can describe them to you people, and some of you even hear bits and pieces of it. It's not something you can get from a book. It's not something that you can by rote say, well, I won't be surprised, I won't be surprised, I won't be surprised. And also, it has nothing to do with not staying fresh. It has nothing to do with, in some way, having less of a kind of biting edge enjoyment of life. It's not being pseudo blasé. It's not being anti-sophisticated, or super sophisticated, I guess it would be in Europe. It is not that. But it is this. You're not surprised by the routine happening over and over. But if you're not prepared, if you do not understand that, then you're continually trapped in this moment. That is the very thing that immediately after the fact, if you were questioning about it, or if you thought about it, you say, well, I knew that asked that. But you brilliant little illegitimate child of Einstein, why don't you ever ask yourself, well, if I knew that, why did I suddenly step backwards? Why was I suddenly, even if it was just for a split moment, which is the only moment that counts, was I doing their agenda? If I had been prepared for it, I would have asked the first question before they knew it. That is, life, under this particular juncture, this particular dance I was about to do with this cop, with this person, with life. Before they could do anything, I would have walked up with my widget and said, does Kmart do any testing anymore, or do they just blindly buy items even when it's from a big name manufacturer like the 3M widget company? Or as soon as the cop got up, if you're going to still sit there and let him come up, you can get out, you can reverse the whole thing, but even if you're sitting there and he gets to the car before you and he leans down, you can say, are these new uniforms? Didn't the people... I am in Tennessee, aren't I? What kind of car is that you're driving back there? As soon as you're surprised, it is almost a sure lead-in for that moment, which is the only one that matters because you're already blinded right then. And so that moment can run into days or hours or even minutes of you doing their agenda. Because as soon as they ask the first question, that is life, invites you to dance in this particular way, as soon as it invites you to dance, you're done for that moment. You will do its agenda, even if it just takes a moment. If the cop says, you do know you're in Tennessee, don't you? For some period of time, you're going to dance with that question. For you people who may have seen this, let me remind you again right quickly. I'm not talking about questions. I'm not talking about the speed limit. I'm not talking about cops. I'm talking about the flow of energy that is life itself and that makes people move and then makes people apparently internally have a thought process. As soon as you are forced to answer a question, as soon as you are submissive to someone else's agenda, you are doing their agenda. That is, you're doing life's agenda. Those of you who continually, and all of you to varying degrees, feel depressed, feel frightened, feel like life is almost out of hand, feel like, oh, if I had the energy I'd be suicidal. All of that sort of stuff can be seen from a certain view, and I'm not talking about literally physical ills, but from another view beyond that. Not to discount that whatsoever, but from another view beyond that, what you think of as being, that is ordinary intelligence thinks of as being forms of depression, mentally depression, and it's in some way psychological. If indeed that were true, then I have just given you not the treatment, the cure. All you've got to do is refuse to do anybody else's agenda. Now, jump from cops and Kmart to your own fucking self. The agenda of one's own dialogue, which is the same thing as the agenda of life. And through your own internal dialogue, it seems to be your own thought processes, your own personality, life asks you to dance, and yet you take it as being, at the very most, or at the very least, according to how you're looking right now, is to be an innocuous operations of the human nervous system. That is, I think about things, I daydream, I talk to myself, but hell, everybody does, right? You know why everybody does? Well, because it's a common and public problem. Ah, what a good memory you got. You can remember something for 15 minutes. All right, maybe it's a personal and private problem. Maybe. How about this? It's life's agenda through everybody, and you take it as either being common and public, but then at other times it seems to be private and personal. You can call it chocolate, you can call it vanilla. It's still ice cream. Or those of you who are old enough to remember that other great New York philosopher, the cartoonist Roth, the girl says, well, I say it's spinach and I say to hell with it. That's another version of chocolate or vanilla. You can call it anything you want to. It is life's agenda. And you take it as being a personal comment, a personal pondering on your own. And you stay surprised. People are surprised, whether they use this word or not, at themselves. I'm surprised I thought of that. Is that a surprise or not? That if I had a clinical objective camera up at a 5D level, then I could show you right quick if it accomplished anything. How many hundreds of thousands of times have you thought that and you'd go, woo? And yet every time I thought it, I went, ah. If you had the nervous system operating above the old level, if you were in touch with a kind of new non-binary based intelligence, then I would say, just quite specifically, that you would no longer be surprised by the predictable and the inevitable. And what else is there? After the fact, everything is predictable and inevitable. Well, yeah, now I look at it, I knew that cop would probably say something like, you know how fast you were going? Boy, how original. But at the time you did not, because at the time the agenda was presented to you. At the time you walked into the restaurant of being alive, and as soon as you sat down, you waited. You're supposed to wait. Everybody knows you do this. And you wait for the waiter to come up and hand you a menu and then say, what would you like? That's the way things go. That's life. As long as you wait for somebody to say, what would you like? You understand that that waiter, I don't care if he's a 90-pound weakling, I don't care if he is as ugly as your dead aunt. You remember the one that used to, well, we don't talk about. For some moment, you are in the hands of that waiter. You are doing his agenda. Now you can say, well, I need to be. I want to get food, and so I've got to tell him. If you'd say such as that, I don't know why you're here, because you're missing the point. All of this is metaphorical. None of this is metaphorical. If you are captive by the moment, you're continually surprised. If you're continually surprised, you are one step away from doing somebody else's agenda. If you're doing somebody else's agenda, you can never use violence in the correct manner or directed toward yourself, because you are never there. You're always in someone else's arms. You can't get to yourself. You might hurt somebody else. They're in the way. People believe, well, I know what I should be doing, but I just can't seem to do it. One reason is you're too busy dancing with strangers. That is, you're too busy doing life's agenda. Does anybody remember? I don't know why this comes to me. I think I had Kyrut one time say the real revolutionists would be the first to say hello and the first to say goodbye. I don't know why that came to me. Well, no matter. That's one of the prices you pay for having periodic moments of lucidity and sobriety, right? It just came, I don't know, I just thought about it. A little more connection. I had several people, I was going to say something anyway, but already tonight wanted to hear more about the tar baby story. The thing I hit, but I wanted to expand on since I brought this up tonight, where I've been trying to get you to look, the tar baby story clearly picture what I verbally described, at least in passing, that the tar baby in the story, and now I will point out that all apparent problems, that is, all foes that people normally believe they confront in life, can be seen as being passive until you take some action. This is not the more complex, multidimensional reality of it, but this is the way it can be seen, and this is the way it cannot ever be seen by old intelligence. That foes, by their very definition, is someone who's going to annoy you, someone who's going to assault your sensibilities, if not your person, your beliefs, your plans. But notice the tar baby, what made it for my use, the perfect story. As it turned out, not enough of you seemed to know the story that was really worthwhile. I could have made it my own story. That the rabbit was captured, done in. The rabbit was a prime example. There he sat finally at the end of the story with all four of his little feet stuck to the tar baby. You could say that there is a prime example of doing somebody else's agenda. Right? But notice several things. The tar baby was inanimate. The tar baby was, which is not literally the point, but was passive. It took action. The rabbit had to actually take his own action. He had to physically attack the tar baby to get defeated, to have the foe come alive, as it were. Another aspect of it, now literally, back to that, the tar baby was not alive. The rabbit was not actually fighting the tar baby, was he? He was fighting the fox that couldn't be seen. That doesn't sound familiar? Yes, I know who my enemies in life are. Really? Would you like me to name them? No, you just did. No, I said I know who my enemies in life are. Would you like for me to tell you who they are? Well, you already did. Well, I can see my enemies. You can see tar babies. You can see beards. Those of you who don't know what a beard is. That's at least a couple, and one of them betrothed to another. When they're trying to do at least partial dance in public, It used to be referred to, they'd pull out somebody to send along to apparently be the person's escort. It was normally on the basis of it being a man trying to fool around with a married woman, and so rather than him be seen with her, he'd have some friend, and he was known as the Beard. The tar baby. Yes, I know who my enemies are. I know who this person is fooling around with. I know what is going on in life. Really? You can see the tar baby. You can see what seems to be the foes of life, your own personal foes and problems. There's a way in which you can properly perceive them as being passive until you take some action. And you can also see them even after you have taken apparently action. That is, you are now involved with some altercation. You are now dancing in a sticky, unprofitable way with this foe. It can be a tar baby, it can be a person, it can be an idea, it can be your own inner dialogue. Because then remember this, the tar baby was not the foe. The rabbit, even as dumb as we'll assume the rabbit turned out to be, the rabbit would not have done anything had not there been the fox behind the tar baby that said, "Hey, you little ugly fucker." So, when the rabbit was fighting the tar baby as best he could, and taking the challenges, and hitting it once and having one paw stuck, and saying, "Turn me loose," and the tar baby apparently says, "Turn you loose? You'll never get loose. You're uglier than I thought up close." The rabbit says, "I'll hit you again." He says, "Try it." Remember, it was not the tar baby talking. And so he fought this foe, gave it every shot he had, which in the rabbit's case turned out to be 4. Gave it every shot he had, and with each shot he did what? As Tennessee Ernie Ford would say, he got deeper in debt. Every blow took him deeper and deeper in debt, and yet, after he gave it every one of his best shots, even if he gave one of them was a knockout blow, notice, you're not going to knock out a tar baby. He wasn't even fighting the tar baby, he thought he was. Enough allegory. Are your problems, are human problems public and common, or private and personal? How are you going to deal with problems if what I am inferring is that you're fighting the wrong foe? You're punching the wrong people, punching the wrong buttons, pulling the wrong strings. But as long as life can have somebody step up to you in line, during that great eternal pastoral queue, while waiting to be cut down, if someone steps up to you and says, "May I ask you a question?" and you're surprised. Who, me? You have what seems to you to be a potential foe when somebody asks me a question. No matter how you respond in that moment, no matter how you respond, you're responding to an illusionary, to a specious source. The girl behind the counter at Kmart, she's not the one that decided, well, anybody that comes in here and they want to return something, I want to see a receipt. I want to see a receipt. Some of these other people may not want to, but when I'm on duty, I want to see a receipt right here. Nobody that works at Kmart ever thought that. Somebody had to tell them. That doesn't sound like the tar baby story? And you've got to be beyond the simplistic level of saying, well, yeah, the manager told her. Don't make me go through this. All right, who told the manager? The district manager. All right, who told him? Mr. Kmart. Well, who told Mr. Kmart? His daddy. And who told his daddy? Would I ever be able to squeeze it out of anybody if they finally went, wait a minute, life made them do it? But you always are apparently fighting some foe that has a question, that has a comment, that has a criticism, that has an what? Agenda. And as soon as it asks you to dance, and you're surprised. Now it takes a split second to be surprised. You're doing their agenda. It's just almost a certainty. It's just one step. Now, forget all this about Kmart and cops and dancing. Alright? Now, forget this. And think about Kmart and dancing and cops. And think about life out there, the way things work. Now, see? You see? It's just as clear as... So until we meet again, our great mystical signal to go along with our motto of... We ain't got no motto.